Good afternoon, Chair, Commissioners. For the record again, Amanda Peets, Director of ODOT's Climate Office. Next slide, please. So I have the pleasure of boring you to death with the results, but hopefully they're informative to you. Next slide. So as I mentioned in my presentation earlier today on the Climate Office overview, the Governor issued Executive Order 2004 earlier this year on climate. One of the requirements in that executive order was to add a greenhouse gas reduction lens to the STIP to inform decisions. Our requirement in the executive order is to develop a methodology by June of next year. But not only do we want to be overachievers, we also know that STIP decisions for the future are being made today. So we want to help influence those before this time frame and look at greenhouse gas emissions. But we don't make decisions, you don't make decisions in consideration of only one factor. And for that reason, we opt to make that job that much harder by looking beyond greenhouse gases and evaluating other things. Next slide, please. This slide shows the 7 outcomes that we identified to evaluate investment trade-offs against. While these are not one-to-one comparable with your strategic action plan, they were pulled out in essence from that. So you'll see for climate, we are evaluating mitigation, so greenhouse gas reduction, as well as adaptation, congestion, social equity, multimodal mobility, safety, and state of good repair. Next slide, please. The analysis process that we use to evaluate trade-offs used real data to assess the results. First, we looked at funding mix for the previous STIP, which was 21 through 24. Then we pulled out data for each and every project that was selected. So we saw how was funding allocated, and then how was that funding actually spent. We identified different project attributes which have the potential to contribute positively or negatively to an outcome area. So which things are good for equity, maybe not as good for equity. Good for reducing greenhouse gas emissions, potentially would increase greenhouse gas emissions. So an individual project may have several different attributes. For example, a bridge project that adds capacity might rate as follows, that kind of chart here in the middle. So you'll see the positive and negative impacts across the different outcome areas. But that same project may have also had an attribute specific to adding a new bike lane or addressing a safety issue. Each attribute was credited proportional to the funding of the associated outcome. So for example, in the example shown here, the project is positive towards climate resilience and adaptation. That way, then, in climate adaptation, we credited the funding that was spent in that project towards it. So we're seeing how we spend towards the outcome areas that you have interest in. Next slide. The results that I'm about to share with you are by no means perfect. We're building the bus as we drive it. In general, we made pretty large gross generalizations about the positive and negative impacts of different attributes. And those are really, on a whole, something like adding transit service would improve greenhouse gas emissions. But oftentimes, results like that depend on where that project is and the variables around that project. And we weren't doing geographic level analysis. It was mainly saying these types of projects generally are good or generally are not as good for certain outcome areas. So it's a fairly blunt tool, but it helps us to start to understand impacts. So we know we need to make improvements. One is for social equity. So you'll see in the results that social equity is linked one-to-one to multimodal. So we didn't differentiate impacts there. As we talked to experts, they seem to think that was a pretty decent way for now of looking at that. In the future, we hope to look more geographically so that we can identify our frontline communities and whether or not projects are serving those frontline communities. So that geographic sensitivity will help. It also helps with other things like understanding the project benefits, congestion, the impact of multimodal projects, and more. There's also other techniques that may be useful in the future to consider. The Oregon Global Warming Commission, for example, has looked at the social cost of carbon as you looked at projects to see what the impacts are over time. That might be something that we look at later on. As we do this type of analysis, there is benefit in keeping some consistency from STIP cycle to STIP cycle so we can look back. What we're doing right now gives us a nice baseline to say what are our emissions from the mix of investments today, and we'll want to compare back to that. So the stability in funding categories and outcomes will be helpful. Next slide, please. So before I get into the results, I want to warn you, this is a lot of information to digest. While we boiled this down to a high level information and pretty pictures at times, there's a lot of substance behind the information. So we tried to boil that down to super high level. We are in the process of documenting that into a report and hope to have that done by the middle of next month. You'll note that some slides I'll go through quickly and just cover highlights. The reason that I included this slide in the first place is because I want you to have the information. So in lieu of us having a report that we can give you with the context around it, we at least wanted to provide you and the public with a little bit more to digest over time beyond just the meeting today. Next slide. So first, we'll look at the results for each scenario. As I mentioned, the baseline is derived from data on how we spent money in the real projects that we selected in the previous cycle. So all results will pivot from this point in time. And as you review the alternative scenarios, so the slides that I'll show after this one, remember that there's also ability to influence spending by setting different program-specific policy. So that may change over time. A few things of what are you looking at on this slide. The pie chart in the upper left shows you the funding splits. So that's what Jeff Sauer shared in the slide that shows you the mix between the different funding categories. Below that shows you what went up or what went down. This is the baseline, so it's unchanged, but you'll see in the other slides it shows the proportion of funding that's changing. The chart on the right shows the results relative to each outcome area. This is the only chart that will show letter grades. I'll note that the letter grades are not the same as level of service. The letter grades are really looking at how are we meeting the needs that exist for that category. So as Travis mentioned, our needs far outpace our available funding. So as you look at the proportion of how much money goes to the Fix-It program, that's a good share of what we have. But even that is falling short of keeping pace with what we need to do to preserve the system. So in state of good repair, you'll see that several assets are deteriorating still. One of the areas we're not performing super well is around climate change, greenhouse gas reduction. So that's an opportunity that we can look for out of this future funding mix. Next slide, please. So you can see from the line in the lower left how funding increases and decreases between the various categories. So the most significant change in this scenario is adding funding for Enhance with additional dollars to non-highway and to safety. In turn, we see improvements to congestion relief. So this is just relative to the baseline. Are things getting better or worse? So we see improvements to congestion relief, multimodal mobility, as well as slight improvements to safety. Greenhouse gas emissions are likely to stay relatively flat in this scenario compared to the baseline. So the multimodal increase in funding helps to offset some of the capacity projects. But the hit in this scenario and the next several comes from the Fix-It program. So the additional increase of money is taken from the Fix-It program. Reducing Fix-It funding impacts our ability to keep bridges and pavements in a state of good repair and to adapt to climate change. So you'll see state of good repair and adaptation are pretty closely linked in the various results. Next slide, please. For scenario 2, non-highway, here we see some key changes in a significant funding shift to non-highway. Greenhouse gas emissions can be reduced most in this scenario. So this is where you optimize the most of the scenarios that we're presenting. Such a substantial increase in funding to non-highway cuts the time frame to complete the bike ped system in half. So substantially moves that needle. Increased multimodal mobility leads to low carbon transportation options for all users, benefiting social equity. Next slide, please. So as Jeff mentioned, there's some similarities between scenario 1 and scenario 3. They both include increases to enhance non-highway and safety categories. However, the amounts vary because there's less for enhance in scenario 3 than there is in scenario 1. Overall results of this scenario are fairly positive, nearly across the board relative to the baseline. The exception, of course, again being state of grid repair and adaptation because of the reduction to the Fix-It program. Next slide, please. But state of good repair and adaptation get their time in the spotlight in this scenario, scenario 4, with an increase of Fix-It funding by about 7%. This funding comes from non-highway and significantly guts that program to the bare minimum requirements. The result of this plays fairly negatively in most categories, with the exception of state of good repair and adaptation. Next slide, please. So I went through those fairly quickly, and I apologize, but really I wanted to leave those with you to look at longer term. What we'll spend probably a little bit more time soaking in on is the summary across the scenario. So next slide, please. So as shown in the arrows in the previous slides, we do see differences between scenarios. However, those differences are not always significant. And this chart helps to illustrate why. The light blue squares in the bar chart, so the squares in the middle, show the play between scenarios. So that's the range of need that you're able to meet with the various scenarios. So those proportions are relatively small. That's why we're seeing kind of a small shift between scenarios. This also shows that the needs are far greater than available funds. And so we took information from our statewide plans and other sources that say, what are our total needs? The bar at the bottom shows current funding or sources outside the STIP. Again, the light blue is showing the play we have between scenarios, and the red is the remaining unmet need. And these are all kind of annualized to the same level. Next slide, please. So while needs far outpace funding, and while there may not be a lot of swing in between the scenarios in terms of addressing that need, you do see some real differences. So this slide illustrates how conditions can improve or be negatively impacted under each scenario. State of good repair, which is the first one shown at the top. Today, about 70% of ODOT's pavements on priority routes, so that's a subset, that's not all pavements, but on priority routes are in fair or better condition. Scenario 4 can improve that ratio, while scenarios 1 and 3 lead to slight backsliding. For multimodal, the other chart shown here at the bottom of the slide, the impact of the scenarios and the time it will take to complete the biking and walking system is significant. Scenario 2 cuts the time frame in half, while scenario 4 more than doubles it. Then moving to the indicator on the right, deferred backlog. So this is looking at how costs may increase over time when we don't invest today. So what's that deferred cost? Deferring activities like preservation can lead to exponential cost increases, whereas we may not be able to save an asset and instead have to replace it. So there's many dimensions to look at as we think about the benefits and trade-offs across. You'll see between state of good repair and the multimodal side, the way that different scenarios play on benefits or negative sides is kind of opposite one another. So that's part of the trade-off to weigh and consider. Next slide, please. So this chart shows in color blocks the same thing that the arrows showed you in the individual results. So basically, when I flip through those individual results, It showed you a green arrow up if something improved, or a red arrow down if something was worse than the baseline. So this is all in comparison to the baseline. So it gives you a sense of, for the various outcome areas, if we change the way that we're funding from the way that we're doing it today, do things improve or do they get worse? And you can see, again, there's a pretty strong correlation between certain categories of when they're positive or when they're negative. Next slide, please. So as you consider what you think about the results, the slide that I just showed, you may wonder, how could some of the outcomes be enhanced? So you might have looked at the previous slide and you say, man, I really like this scenario, but it's showing red for outcome so-and-so. What this graphic is trying to show is how much you change that. So if you want to improve an outcome area, what bucket of funding might you focus on? As a reminder, these are all based on how money was spent in 21 through 24, so the previous STIP cycle. That's the relationship we got out of looking at real projects to see how they positively or negatively contribute to the various areas. So policy changes for, say, the Fix-It program and focusing more on adaptation, or the safety program and focusing more on disadvantaged areas can lead to slightly different outcomes than what's shown here, but that's a policy choice on the program. But what we see from current spending today is that greenhouse gas reduction is most positively impacted with increases to non-highway, that enhance has a mix of many different types of projects, but many of the capacity increases may negatively affect greenhouse gas emissions. As I said before, Fix-It has a kind of one-to-one relationship with adaptation and also state of good repair. Congestion relief is benefited by investments in the Enhance program, but also non-highway and some safety projects that address intermittent delay. Social equity and multimodal mobility, as I mentioned earlier, we put these two things together. Benefited by non-highway, equity, and multimodal mobility also benefited by Fix-It. Bikes and transit buses use the same facility as cars. So making sure that those roadways are in decent condition is also key to making sure those modes are viable. And safety projects as well that especially address vulnerable users and other needs. For safety, and Travis made this point earlier, of really we have safety ingrained in everything that we do, and it's really evident in what we found in the results. So it just shows that when you have a top priority for an agency, there are ways you can really integrate it into everything you do, so that every single investment program that we have here can benefit safety. The direct benefits, most direct, come when you put money in the safety pot. That money can be focused strategically on fatalities and serious injuries, but you get many co-benefits by investments in the other areas. And then state of good repair can be benefited by the Fix-It program. Also, many safety investments can help with that. And then when in cases where Enhance is funding capacity expansion, that's more roadways to take care of, so a slight negative impact there. Next slide, please. So, but before turning you loose to chew on results, which will be the slide after this one, I thought it might be helpful to emphasize some of the key findings. So as you've seen in the charts and the one here shown on the right, the needs far outweigh available funds. There's a number of historically underfunded outcome areas. So we've looked at a couple of different cycles to see progress towards meeting needs. The top ones that tend to be underfunded include climate change mitigation and multimodal mobility and social equity. There are key relationships between funded categories and outcomes. So non-highway most benefits greenhouse gas mitigation, multimodal mobility, and social equity. Fix-It most benefits state of good repair and adaptation resilience. Specific to climate change, and you may ask, why do you have one specific to climate change? What about the other areas? One, it's me presenting. The other one is because the executive order is what directed us to do this kind of analysis in the first place. So I did want to highlight how the results show for greenhouse gas mitigation. So scenario 2 has the highest potential positive impact, while scenario 4 has negative impacts for greenhouse gas mitigation. That said, on the climate front, it has the most positive for the adaptation side. Next slide, please. So the final slide that I will show you, and I'm more than happy to flip back to any of the others and talk through those. This is a summary chart, and it's slightly different than the one I showed earlier. So this one includes the baseline in the mix, because thinking that you may want to consider that. The analysis that we did yielded scores. The scores aren't shown here. We've kept it up at a higher level. And the shading was done really commensurate with those scores, relative of performance for each outcome area. So the highest score among scenarios is shaded as bright green. So if you're looking across the first category, like what scenario did best for greenhouse gas reduction? Scenario 2, it's the bright green one. What did second best? Scenario 3, safety on highway, it's the light green one. Of the 5 scenarios, which one did worse? In the top one, it would be scenario 4, fix it, for mitigation. So that's the color correspondence. You'll see there's a difference between the bright red and the light red. The bright red is where you see a significant decline from the baseline. The light red is where it's pretty similar to the baseline in terms of what the score was, but it was the lowest score across the categories. So this just gives you a side-by-side so you can see how the different scenarios performed relative to one another. And our hope is that some of this information can help you decide if there's scenarios here that you want to throw out of contention. Maybe they're not right, or maybe there's 1 or 2 that look decent to you, but you want to modify. And maybe those bubble charts that I showed earlier can help you modify those.